now we'd like to move on to our next speaker, which we are very privileged to have, Professor Powell speaking to us live from Queensland. Professor Powell, the floor is yours.
Look, thank you very much. If it's okay with you, I might just share a few slides, and it might just help focus perhaps focus my remarks and help people follow along as well. You should be able to see on screen, hopefully, the cover page of my presentation. Look, first and foremost, though, let me thank the organisers of today's event to bring people from many parts of the world together to share their thoughts and to exchange knowledge and experience in the hope of contributing to achieving better outcomes in terms of the kinds of aspirations that I think, at least as matters of principle, underpin the agenda or the discourse of rights, and particularly the protection of minorities. I've called my talk today Rights in a Multipolar World with a question mark, with a subtitle, Beware the Golden Weasel, and I'll explain what that is as we progress through. And it's in large part because I've spent the best part of 50 years of my life experiencing, in many respects, certain dimensions or aspects of being a minority, and not only drawing on my own experiences, but also my research and observations about the successes or otherwise of the rights discourse to fulfill the ambitions that we have invested in them. So today's remarks really aim to, I guess, be a little bit provocative, with the aim of pushing us to think a little bit harder and a little bit more creatively around this space, because there isn't a doubt, and you'll see in my slide shortly, that despite the virtuous nature of the objectives articulated in the rights discourse, particularly as it's manifest since the Second World War, we live with significant and chronic disappointment. As I said, my subtitle is Beware the Golden Weasel, and it draws from a Chinese saying, which is 黄鼠狼给几百年没安好心. And what that largely points to is that it's important to beware the weasel bearing gifts. And as good as many things sound, there's always more to the story than what you see on the cover. And I think the same challenges exist when it comes to the ways in which we think about not only rights discourse itself, but importantly, how those rights discourses actually become reality on the ground. So my talk really just has 5 simple provocations more than anything else. And they are really aimed at making us think a little bit. And I did them largely because it made me think. So hopefully they will be received in the spirit of sharing, and with the hope that they help push our collective imaginations further along this important piece of work. So provocation number 1 is that the notion of rights themselves are historical. And that gives rise to a number of challenges in the way that we approach these questions. It means that we need to be sensitive to the genealogy of what constitutes these rights and how we understand them to be, and the contexts that actually gave rise to them and that continue to give them life. Invariably, it means that we can't avoid the issues of the institutions and the political lenses through which rights discourse works their way through the global body politic and ultimately into the body politic of member states. The third thing it does is that it constantly forces us to think about the relationship between what we might have a sense of being the transcendental, the universal, and the particular. Now, from a transcendental point of view, I think it's probably fair to say that there is a general sense that the purpose of rights discourse is to contribute towards initiatives that will alleviate suffering and contribute to empowering people, whoever they are, whatever they are, wherever they are, to have the ability to lead fulfilling lives. That seems to me to be the transcendental component of rights discourse. The challenge, of course, is how that manifests in the particular, and that means understanding its history and its location in space and time. My second provocation is that, in fact, rights discourse as we understand it today has largely run its course. That's not to say that the issues of concern at a transcendental level are not of concern. In fact, quite the contrary, they are. It's to say that the ways in which we've thought about approaching them need to be reimagined. Rights discourse emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War and the emergence of a new set of international institutions aimed at creating a world order that would avoid the problems that led up to the Second World War, and which would address the problems that had beset the world in the previous 100 or even 200 or 300 years. But in doing so, the ideas that underpinned how we thought about and described rights was intimately entangled with the history of liberalism itself, and particularly liberalism as a colonial rationality. Liberalism has a long history in the West, both as a system of political thought, but also as a technology of governance and global political and economic intervention. As a form of colonial rationality, liberalism was anchored in practices that defined people in terms of what constituted civilized and what constituted barbaric. And at the heart of this intellectual, cultural endeavour that played out politically across the global stage was very particular views about what constituted a civilized individual. And within liberal discourse, this notion of a civilized individual was one that would be rational and capable of self-government and capable of extricating themselves from the constraints of the tribe, of the culture, and of the masses. Because without that ability, it would be impossible for this individual to not only govern themselves, but to form the basis of self-governing communities. Ultimately, as it was imbricated in networks of colonial power, these ideas of what constituted a civilized individual became enmeshed in a millenarian politics, where the mission, if you will, of liberalism was to civilize the barbaric and to transform the jungle into the garden. And so rights discourse became tightly interwoven with the idea that history had an overarching purpose and that there would be an end state, which would look something like the imaginations of the Western liberal political elite. Which ultimately led to what I would say is my third provocation, and that is that rights discourse has, notwithstanding its virtuous foundations in the immediate years after the Second World War, became increasingly weaponized. Between 1990 and 2019, a 30-year period that I think we could broadly call the 30 years of Pax Americana, or the 30 years of American unipolarity, the United States actually initiated 3.7 military interventions per year on average. And those interventions were more intensive quantitatively and qualitatively compared to the period in between 1946 and 1989. In that period, the United States initiated 2.4 interventions per year on average. That was the quantitative side. Qualitatively, these interventions in the unipolar period were increasingly undertaken in the name of the protection or the advancement of some form of liberal rights, whether it was a notion of freedom, a notion of democracy, and a notion of liberty. So rights discourse became entangled not only from a history of the colonial enterprise, but in fact, in a post-colonial context, became ensnared in an American militarization and weaponization. So that's provocation number 3. Unsurprisingly, in that practical context, as opposed to the great context of human aspiration and ambition, the effect has been to elide the real problems of rights, the real problems of economic and social empowerment and cultural discrimination and racial discrimination, whereby the champions of the rights themselves were able to carry on as the great abusers. And they became, in many regards, a testament to the efficacy of power over the efficacy of virtuous ideas. And as the great abusers, we can see that in practical terms, as much as they would militarily intervene in other countries in the name of rights, they were themselves the worst when it came to protecting and advancing the rights of minorities in their own countries, as well as in the countries in which they intervened. The end result, sadly, was the undermining of the genuine pursuit of the improvement of the human condition. Now, this image is actually a contemporary image of Black Americans who are being frog-marched to continue working in the fields as effectively slave labour. That, by the way, is the accusation that's usually levelled by the Americans at other countries. And let me show you some images just to bring the point home. I won't talk too much to the specific images, but I want you just to soak them in, to get a sense of the gap between aspiration and reality. And of course, we see here the situation in Palestine today. We also see here the plight of Australian Aborigines in the top right, where alcoholism and drug abuse continues to deny these people the same living and lifestyle opportunities that others in the society experience. We have here the tangible consequences of the failure of rights discourse. In Australia, in the top right again, as well as in the tragedy of Palestine as it is today. But aside from war, we also have the incarceration of migrants in the top right-hand side, and we have homelessness in the streets of the UK and in the US and in Canada. And the homeless, of course, are outnumbered disproportionately by minorities, American Indians, and the traditional owners, the First Nations peoples of Canada. So we can see here the in-your-face consequences of the ineffectiveness, if you will, of rights discourse. Which brings me to my last provocation. And my last provocation, in some ways, is the most provocative. And that is that rights discourse has now become a tool of hegemony. Over the course of the last 70 years, a plethora of organisations have emerged, ostensibly funded with a mission of carrying out and implementing the ambitions of the rights discourse as human civilizations across the world articulated over 70 years ago. And yet, in practical terms again, many of these organs, these apparatuses, these bodies, have become the funded extensions of American foreign policy, wherein over the course of the last 20 years or so, in parallel to the explicit military interventions that I noted earlier, these agencies have been intimately involved in the organisation and the provocation of colour revolutions across the world. Unfortunately, the ambitions that I think we all share for the protection and advancement of rights have somewhere between the day when human civilizations came together and agreed to them as our objectives has become detached from how they are implemented and realized in reality. And as the global landscape is transforming from a world where American unipolarity dominated the geopolitical landscape to a world in which multiple powers and individual nations seek to assert sovereignty again, it behoves us to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to reimagine the substance of rights in the context of a multipolar world. And on that note, I end my presentation today. Thank you very much.